Forum. The Humanities Forum is an initiative of the Humanities program at Providence College, directed by Professor Jim Keating and moderated by Professor Raymond Hain. My name is Pat McFarland. I teach in the philosophy department and the development of Western civilization program. Because Professor Hain is on sabbatical this semester, he asked me to help moderate the Humanities Forum. The forum is pleased to welcome to campus today a distinguished guest and a native son, Brother Jordan Zajac. Brother Jordan hails from New Bedford, Massachusetts, and was graduated from Providence College in 2004, summa cum laude, with a BA in English. Brother Jordan went on to earn an MA in English Literature from the University of Virginia in 2006, and completed his Ph.D. in English Literature at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2013. 2 weeks after he defended his dissertation in 2013, he was in the great city of Cincinnati, Ohio, to begin his novitiate year in the Order of Preachers. For the last 5 years, Brother Jordan has been studying philosophy and theology in preparation for his ordination to the priesthood. He was just ordained a deacon this month. Brother Jordan has recently been assigned to a year of pastoral ministry at Providence College as a deacon, starting in the fall semester 2019, this coming fall, and he'll be working in campus ministry. We are honored that God, in his providence, has returned Brother Jordan to us today. Please help me in welcoming back Brother Jordan Zajac to his alma mater.
Thank you very much. It's good to be home. Everybody knows what happens when you drink too much. Shakespeare makes fun of you. In what is believed to be one of his very first plays, in the very first scene, Shakespeare decides to let drunkenness take center stage. It's a comedy entitled The Taming of the Shrew. The action begins outside an alehouse with a hostess, a barmaid, a bartender, chasing a drunken customer out into the streets. She threatens to have him arrested for the commotion that he's caused within. He's broken glasses, he's caused a huge disruptive scene. He swears her off, asserting that he will stand his ground, and then he promptly falls to the ground, fast asleep in his drunken stupor. It's utterly pathetic and entirely funny. His name is Christopher Sly, S-L-Y, and there's nothing sly about him. So then a lord, a member of the English upper class, and his attendants come across this sorry sight. The lord looks at Sly, sees an easy target, and decides to play a trick on him. He has his men carry this commoner back to the bedroom of his estate, dress him in fine attire, and then, when Sly awakes, treat him as if he himself is a noble lord, a mighty lord. They shower him with praise. They wait on him hand and foot. They tell him that he's been suffering from lunacy for years, imagining that he's a mere commoner, when in fact he is a nobleman with a beautiful wife, many children, great riches. Now he's finally come to his senses, they tell him. He quickly embraces this deception and acts like he's the mightiest nobleman anyone's ever seen. It's a paradoxical exchange. He's made to believe that he's climbed high because he's overindulged and fallen so low. In other words, because Sly doesn't know his own limits, he ends up losing any grasp on who he actually is, or what his true social rank and status are. So Shakespeare decides to organize a whole play around a joke on a drunk guy. This choice is significant for several reasons. First, this scene with Christopher Sly gestures toward a crucial but commonly overlooked element of Shakespearean theater culture, namely the playhouses' close proximity to and relationship with drinking houses. In Shakespeare's London, theaters and taverns go together. The connection is so close, in fact, that one member of Shakespeare's own theater company actually owned and operated a tavern attached to the theater where this play, The Taming of the Shrew, would end up being staged. So what Shakespeare is doing in this play then is staging his own audience in a very novel kind of way. What's happening on stage, if you think about it, you want to go see a play, so you cross the river, you cross the Thames, you get to the other side. Playhouses are all down there, and you want to grab a pint before the curtain. So you're sitting there, and then all right, it's time for the curtain. You get up, you go outside the tavern, inside of the playhouse, and immediately you see a scene like outside the tavern. What's happening on stage is a fictional extension of what's going on right next door and all around the theaters. And dramatists like Shakespeare make sure that the art they're producing offers a commentary upon what's happening next door at that drinking house. The theater loved to stage its own audiences and encourage those audience members to think critically about the recreational choices they were making. So theaters and taverns go together, and there's an element of social commentary involved. Now there's commentary, and then there's like tooling on someone. And the Christopher Sly joke is basically Shakespeare making fun of his clientele, or at least perhaps some portion of them. This choice would seem inadvisable. I mean, I wouldn't make fun of you students. I'm glad you're all here. I wouldn't make fun of you for being here on a Friday afternoon. I do hope you at least getting like extra credit or something. But, I wouldn't make fun of you. Shakespeare, however, has a good reason to make fun of this drunkenness. He and his fellow playwrights have two extremes to deal with. On the one hand, there are these political and religious figures, okay, often Puritans, who are like vehemently opposed to both the commercial theater and a commercial drinking culture. They're ministers who like set up pulpits right outside the theater and preach against the perceived sinfulness going on stage. And they'll publish these things called anti-theatrical tracts, like pamphlets, short books, decrying the social ills and the vices that they think the theater causes. They see it all as morally dangerous. At the same time, this group is preaching against drinking culture and writing what are called temperance tracts, although it's not actually temperance. Temperance is something different. So to them, theater culture and drinking culture have no redeeming qualities. They're on one extreme. They're completely insensitive to what might be potentially good in either having a nice pint or enjoying a nice play. And when I say they're insensitive, I mean like they have an inordinate aversion to these pleasures. It's excessive in and of itself. And on the other hand, you have dudes like Christopher Sly running around who do overindulge and do cause disturbances in the theaters and in the taverns, and someone should make fun of them. So there's lots of ways that recreational activities lead to excess, which in turn could lead to idleness and disorder, crime and violence, social unrest. So you've got these two extremes. I would argue that Shakespeare and English commercial theater seeks to find a virtuous mean in the middle, to occupy a middle ground between these two extremes. By and large, the theater seeks to be moderate and to moderate, that is, educate in the virtue of moderation. And they do so by making fun of both of these extremes, those who overindulge as well as those who refuse to indulge at all. This effort is what I would like to call a virtues pour, P-O-U-R. It recognizes the vital role that our appetite for sense pleasures plays in the perfection and the full flourishing of human beings. It neither overemphasizes them, nor undermines them. It's like anti-theatricalists, those Puritan types, would look at a scene like I just described from The Taming of the Shrew, and they would decry the vice on stage. It tempts people to drink too much. It celebrates overindulgence. The theater makes money off of glorifying sinful and bad behavior. Shakespeare would refute this, however. Do these plays capitalize and make a profit on staging vice? Absolutely. But by making fun of vice and excess, and by extension, celebrating virtue. We find this dynamic at work in a number of plays in the period, and I'll march you through a few of them this afternoon. This commentary on virtue and vice is a constitutive element of what the professional theater is all about. I would argue that theater is, in particular, a socially efficacious art form. That means that dramatists are interested in shaping theatergoers' ideas about themselves and about the world around them. The theater not only wants to entertain, but also educate, to explore the social and political realm it occupies and make audiences think critically and constructively about society and culture and themselves. It wants audience members to think about who they are, how they were related to others, why this matters, and to enjoy themselves all the while they're doing this. So I hope to show in this talk that the theater is interested in exploring, one, the utmost of what humans can be. That is, the realization of our full, virtuous human potential. And also, two, the sad depths into which we can descend. You're most fully and authentically yourself. When? When you're acting to your full human potential, which in the Western tradition means virtuously. That's the idea that runs like a live wire around the Shakespearean stage. And there are many opportunities to stray from that virtuous mean, especially with alcohol, because especially in this period, it's interesting, drinking was a constitutive part of everyday life. And I want to just give a little bit of background about booze. Okay, there they are. All right. Alcoholic beverages, a dietary staple in Elizabethan England in Shakespeare's period. Everyone drank every day, multiple times a day. Okay, cool. Why? There weren't very many other viable options. Seriously. Water supplies, unreliable. Water also tended to prove unsanitary for consumption. Milk, mostly used for the production of cheeses and butter. The English like butter more than they like drinking milk. Fruit juice, a little OJ, difficult to preserve at this period. All right, tea and coffee. Actually, luxury items. Luxury items only starting to arrive in England about a generation after Shakespeare's. Even when these were available, they remained expensive luxuries far beyond the reach of most people for many years. And it wasn't until like the late 18th century that tea became a common drink in England and is associated with England. So in Shakespeare's day, unless you were prepared to take the risk of drinking the water, being a teetotaler just wasn't an option. You couldn't even have tea. Everybody drank. So alcoholic drinks like ale and beer actually offered a vital source of daily nourishment. Have you ever seen these 20th century Guinness ads, Guinness for your health? I like them. They actually have some historical grounding. Beer and ale were beverages that contained precious calories, especially for the working class, strengthening them for their day's labor. Wine and beer were used to help prevent and treat illnesses. They were used as vital ingredients in tonics and medicinal compounds. When I was first researching this topic as a graduate student, I was at the British Library in the manuscript room, and I was looking through the details, these manuscripts about everyday domestic life in Renaissance England, and I came across an entry that read, it was a housewife writing about everything going on in her household. The baby has a toothache, so I gave it some beer. I gave her some beer. And I was like, what? Yep, everybody drank. So alcohol existed as an essential part of everyday life. It was brewed not only commercially, but domestically as well. Everyone was a home brewer. Wives would typically brew at home for the household's daily consumption. And you'd have some weak stuff for breakfast. You had to get up and actually do something. So they, the first runnings were for the winter seasons, especially higher alcohol, more robust, or maybe just later in the day when you had a bigger meal. But even for breakfast, they'd have like a second running, they call it small beer. And that got you going. To suggest that most of the history of Western civilization was lived in a mild state of inebriation is an exaggeration, but only a slight one. Alcohol consumption was a widespread habitual practice, and the habitual nature of it is important here. We think drinking habit means alcoholism, but not all drinking habits per se are necessarily vicious, like bad. Granted, it is easy to slip into vice with something like alcohol, and the self-discipline it requires to have a healthy, temperate drinking habit that leads to authentic human flourishing. And for this reason, Shakespeare's age was obsessed with the matter of maintaining a moderate balance in alcohol consumption. So alcohol didn't mean the same thing in Shakespeare's time as it does in ours, and the theater didn't as well. It didn't mean the same thing. We tend to associate Shakespeare's plays, well, with the highest expressions of human artistry, and that's true. Going to the theater now, what do you think? You think like, I gotta get dressed up, it's expensive. It's a sign of sophistication where everyone sits and acts like they understand the archaic language that's being used, and very few do. But in Shakespeare's day, plays were the stuff of popular culture, not high culture. Going to see a play was the equivalent of going to see a movie. People from all across the social spectrum, the elite and the working class alike, found themselves together in these public theaters, which were open year-round. These social groups were distanced from each other. The expensive box seats versus the groundlings is what they'd call them. These commoners who would pay a penny just to get into the pit, like right at the base of the stage. But they were all there together. So early modern London was replete with pints and plays. Drinking houses were ubiquitous in England in general and in London in particular. This to keep up with the prodigious population growth happening during Shakespeare's time. Between 1550 and 1650, London's population expanded from about 80,000 to 400,000. The number of drinking establishments boomed as well. The playwright, Thomas Dekker, writes that in London, quote, "A whole street is in some place but a continuous alehouse." How do I move there? And a German tourist to London writes, "I have never seen more taverns and alehouses in my whole life than in London." And that's, Germans, they like to drink too, so that's substantial. Where there are theaters, there are taverns. There's in one neighborhood where there were 2 commercial playhouses, we can find records of there being 13 alehouses right in that same neighborhood. So they're perceived as possessing the same pleasures and dangers, and they're intimately linked. And the theater is trying to negotiate and respond to attacks being made on both of these institutions. Now, before Shakespeare, some playwrights actually play into and use these negative attitudes toward drinking houses to their advantage. There are stage plays where taverns are the place where criminals hang out. It's like Federal Hill. There's one tragedy, for example, called Arden of Faversham, where there's a wife who wants to have her husband offed so she can marry another dude, and she's thinking, how do I pull this off? How do I get this done? I know. I'll go to London. They say that murderers for hire hang out in the alehouses. I'll find one there. And then we see how these hired murderers that she employs do in fact organize their entire criminal lives around their time in drinking houses. And this would be playing precisely into the anxieties articulated in those temperance tracts that I talked about. Another interesting example that appeals directly to England's national identity and national history is a play called The Famous Victories of Henry V. This King Henry, was a famous English monarch. And the play is about his transformation from a riotous youth, he's kind of a prodigal son type, to a great warrior and a great ruler, culminating in his victory over the French and his wooing of the French princess, which solidifies peace between the two countries. And in Shakespeare's time, King Henry V is a legend. There's as much historical distance between this period in English history and Shakespeare's as there is between our time and the U.S. Civil War. So these are plays, they're very popular. They're kind of like the equivalent of Civil War movies, World War I movies maybe. So when he's a young man, King Henry V, or he will become King Henry V, he's known to live this life of debauchery, and that's what we find happening in this play. The audience hears a story about him and his buddies getting drunk at taverns and brawling in the streets and getting arrested, kind of like Lindsay Lohan gone wild or something. But one of the tavern workers, a boy, they had no child labor laws back then, recounts at one point, whether their music liked them not, or whether they had drunk too much wine or no, I cannot tell, but our pots flew against the walls, and then they drew their swords and went into the street and fought. Sounds like Christopher Sly spilling out into the streets, right? This play, The Famous Histories, reinforces a common connection between drinking houses and riotous depravity. The prince's reformation, his coming out of this, is treated as a total miraculous occurrence because all the signs, especially those associated with his life of drinking, indicate that his succession to the throne will usher in a period of devastation and tyranny. And this was the idea shaped by humanist thinkers like Erasmus, for example, who describes how a royal child who's not properly schooled will become a tyrannical ruler. Such a guy will spend his time among whores, degenerate comrades, drinkers, gamblers, and pleasure-mongers, as foolish as they are worthless. I like that term, pleasure-mongers. In this company, he hears nothing, learns nothing, takes in nothing except pleasure, amusements, pride, arrogance, greed, irascibility, and bullying. Does this sound like your phone calls home to mom on Sunday nights? As as boys they did nothing but play at tyrants, what, I ask you, he concludes, are they to work at as adults except tyranny? So this description captures well the prince in this anonymous play and his education in debauchery. His passions seize tyrannical control of his reason, which should be governing those passions. He can't rule his own body. How can he rule the body politic? Here's the fascinating thing. Shakespeare takes precisely these circumstances surrounding this very prince, this story that everybody knows, and he uses them as a model for kingly education. He stages his own version of the same story. There's no intellectual property rights, no copyright back then. It was cool. And he dramatizes the rise of the same king, but he subverts this humanist paradigm, dramatizing a princely education that is actually shaped and enhanced by the tavern, by drinking. This move is, that's our like zeitgeist right there. This move is astoundingly unorthodox and supremely original. So original, in fact, that it appears that Shakespeare is actually the very first commercial playwright to use the tavern as a dramatic setting. In that other play I just described, everything happens. There's action outside the play, outside the tavern. We hear about what goes on inside the tavern, but we never get in. We never get inside. And it is, I could be wrong on this, but all my research indicates that Shakespeare is the very first playwright in England to stage scenes inside a contemporary looking and sounding drinking house. He's doing something totally new, a totally novel, dramatic innovation. And when people have been poring over a genius's work for hundreds of years and publishing everything they can, a detail like this counts as scholarship. I got a dissertation out of this. I got a Ph.D. out of figuring this out. I could be wrong too, right? But no one's challenged me yet. But I really do think like he's the first one. It's just completely novel. The play I'm referring to for him is called King Henry IV. We know it as King Henry IV Part 1. It was so successful that there's a Part 2. And in it, Shakespeare has a whole plot in the tavern. So instead of the future king being a party animal, Shakespeare's version of the story, good, I thought I hit this thing. Shakespeare's version of the story, in his version, all the excess is condensed and displaced onto another character. His name is Sir John Falstaff. So the young prince and his whole gang of friends and followers who hang out in the tavern with him, not noble courtier types, but a band of the brash and the indulgent. And Falstaff is there too. They're all there. And Falstaff exerts a kind of gravitational force over everyone involved. He is like literally larger than life. He's absolutely corpulent. Dr. Steve Lynch drew this on the board in the fall of 2003. And it left an impression on me. It's true. It captured it so well. So Falstaff he's an appetite with legs, okay? Really little ones. But he's larger than life. He eats too much, he drinks too much, he talks too much, and way too boldly, especially with the prince. He is a figure of irrepressible, outrageous, comic vanity and vitality. He's supremely witty and slippery, even better at getting out of trouble than he is at getting into it, and he gets into it all the time. He's arguably the most memorable character that Shakespeare's ever written, and that very few get to know nowadays. And most importantly, the prince, the guy who's going to be the king, is able to resist all this charm. He doesn't fall into the gravitational pull. Falstaff should be a corrupting influence on the prince, but he's not. He ultimately does the opposite. He makes the prince more keenly aware of his future responsibilities as a sovereign and the virtue that will be required for the job. Now the two, let's see. I want to skip ahead a little bit. I had some stuff on the classics majors, but we're just gonna skip ahead. Basically, there's an interesting connection. Now I'm going to do it, even though I said I wasn't going to. Interesting connection between like temperance, the virtue, and a sense of timing, and it's just rooted in the origin of the words. But temperance is basically about not enjoying too much too quickly, not losing one's sense of both the time and the true pleasure of what one is enjoying. Shakespeare creates a whole comic plot line out of this tension. So Falstaff has been so intemperate that he's completely lost his senses. And it's the first scene between the two characters. And this is our first introduction to the two, and this is how it starts. Falstaff asks the prince, what time is it? And you can imagine he's already done his fair share of day drinking, and he's completely lost any sense of the time. And the prince responds with a series of epic insults. He replies, "Thou art so fat-witted of old sack," which is a Spanish white wine, big hit in the period, "and unbuttoning thee after supper. Thou art so fat-witted with drinking of old sack and unbuttoning thee after supper, and sleeping upon benches at noon, that thou hast forgotten to demand that truly which thou wouldst know truly. What a devil hast thou to do with the time of day? Unless hours were cups of sack, and minutes capons, and clocks the tongues of bawds, and the dials the signs of leaping houses, and the blessed sun himself a fair hot wench, I see no reason why thou shouldst be so superfluous to demand the time of the day." To summarize, what time is it? You're so drunk, what does it matter to you? The only reason you would pay attention to the time and the way you've misspent the time is if the clock hands themselves were cups of wine, if sundials were brothels, and the sun itself was a prostitute. Everything is ordered to and organized around sense pleasures for Falstaff. Remember, when you drink too much, Shakespeare makes fun of you. Falstaff fights back, and he's supremely resistant, and perhaps we can talk about this more in the question and answer, no pun intended. But because I want to move on, and there's so much we could do this for. Can I come back every Friday and just keep talking about this play? At the very end of this scene, there's also just another important soliloquy, a speech that the prince gives, where he reveals all his cards, and the fact becomes apparent that his prodigality is all staged. It's just fascinating. So he has a strategy. I have another one, Brother Jordan. He has a strategy for everything that he's going to do. He's going to feign his prodigality and rise above it. And he says, No one else is on stage. He's just delivering it to us. Like, we're inside on this, and that's important too. My reformation, he says, glittering over my fault, what I'm going to do, shall show more goodly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set it off. I'll create such a contrast between how I seem now in the tavern and how I'm going to actually be when I get in charge, that it'll be better than ever having just pursued virtue for itself. I'll so offend, he boasts, to make offense a skill, redeeming time when men least think least I will. I'll use my perceived misbehavior for my own advantage, taking full advantage of the time and making up for this time that I've wasted. So even though this play is called a chronicle history play, it's about English civil history, it's also more fundamentally about, it's a comedy. And comedies are about purging the excess desire for the sake of a healthier, more temperate enjoyment. And that's what's occurring in this play overall. The tavern facilitates this temperate enjoyment in a way that no other dramatic setting can. All right, so in the time I have left, I want to change gears and talk about another interesting aspect of drinking and theater going in this period. There's a whole critical commonplace that describes the relationship between women and drinking culture. And this is the commonplace, and I want to complicate this. This is one scholar, anonymous, not actually anonymous, I'm just going to keep them anonymous, sums it up well here as they say, the household and the drinking house were contradictory, opposed locales, competing with each other across gender lines. Whereas the household was a feminine stronghold, a site entrusted to female care and management, the alehouse, even when, as was often the case, run by a woman, was predominantly a male space. So even when women are associated with drinking houses, it's usually very unflattering. Just proof text for this. Yeah, very popular poem in the period is called The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming. And she's, yeah. It's like, did this guy even try? She's just this, she's physically hideous. Usually, like, there are these epic poems with a blazon where you describe the female subject's beauty in incredible terms, comparing it to celestial bodies, jewels, all sorts of great things. In this poem, she's compared, let's see, where is it? Her face is crinkled and wrinkled like a pig's ear. So this is trying to be accurate. And then, the poem goes on to describe she's an alewife, she's got all these like terrible practices in the alehouse. She puts like chicken excrement in the ale to doctor it, give it a little kick. I don't know, just weird stuff. And we're told this is a pervasive image of what women's role was like in theater, in tavern culture. But there are plays, people don't really read much, that complicate this simplistic, reductive kind of image. There's one comedy called The Fair Maid of the West, and it's all about a young, virtuous woman who, her family's short on money, she starts working at a tavern. Basically, she's so virtuous that she draws like all the customers to herself. Every other tavern and alehouse goes out of business because everyone just wants to just go be around her, because the goodness is diffusive of itself. Like, there's something attractive about her, and it's such a popular play that there's a sequel, and it really just complicates a lot of what scholars think about the role of women in the period. I'm cutting this very short. So one of these, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, I had a longer description of this play, but you're going to get bored because it doesn't sound very dynamic, and that would seem to be the point. But actually, there's a lot of demand for this kind of thing. And Thomas Heywood, who wrote the play, describes it in a tract that he has, where he is, if you just see the end of this quote, women likewise that are chaste are by us extolled in our plays and encouraged in their virtues. So the theater is seen as a site where it's a healthy corrective device to vice in education and virtue. Heywood goes on to make a teleological argument, which is to say an argument based on the goal or purpose for which recreations exist. About the theater's opponents, he says, I hold them more scrupulous than well-advised that go about to take from us the use of all moderate recreations. Why hath God ordained for man a variety of meats, dainties, and delicacies, if not to taste thereon? Why doth the world yield choice of honest pastimes, if not decently to use them? Since God hath provided us of these pastimes, why may we not use them to his glory? So dramatists can stage action and behaviors like drunkenness, which are contrary to virtue and the glory of God precisely for the glory of God, and then they can also depict virtuous types as well. This one's awesome. We present men, he says, in the ugliness of their vices, to make them the more abhor them. As the Persians, who above all sins loathe drunkenness, are accustomed in their solemn feasts to make their servants and captives extremely overcome with wine, get them drunk, and then to call their children to view these nasty and loathsome behaviors, making them hate that sin in themselves which showed itself so gross and abominable in others. That's one way to do it. The like use may be gathered of the drunkards so naturally imitated in our plays. We do a good job staging drunks. We're good at it. But it's not so that you delight in it. Even though there is, he says, the applause of the actor, people give the actors props, there's content among theatergoers, but it's to reprove the vice, not to applaud it. And vice is profitable in this way. The actors make a profit off of it, but there's more to it than that. Okay, so just as with that play I described, The Fair Maid of the West, there's another play called Westward Ho that goes to great lengths to construct an alternative version of moderate consumption and fidelity among females, which in turn also calls guy drinkers, dudes, into, calls them into question, calls them to task. So it's a play about everyday Londoners, not the usual subject matter, and it's organized around like three groups of characters. You've got these overbearing, jealous husbands, their virtuous wives, and then these young guys who party too much. And it's basically the tale of two taverns, or two tavern experiences. First, you've got these wives who are witty, wise, resourceful, who utilize the tavern as a space in which they can get away from their overbearing husbands. They're depicted as discerning customers, knowledgeable of the codes and customs of tavern culture, the deceits and the threats that the space poses, and they negotiate them deftly. They know what's good, and they know why it's good, and they're made good by their participation in the tavern. They have a penchant for moderate enjoyment of the space, and the play contrasts them to the groups of male drinkers, especially, I'll focus on just the young gallants who are just like every other guy drinker I've been explaining or describing so far. They emerge in one scene from a place called the Lion Tavern, which is appropriate because they appear beastly drunk. And this touches upon, they make a spectacle of themselves and all this sort of stuff. They're basically like brute animals running around on stage. And there's a whole genre of tracts and treatises in this period that we could call, discourses of the early modern party animal. This is just one of them. Look at these guys. You've got the raging lion in the top left corner, the sloshed swine in the bottom right, next to the guzzling goat. It's a comic channeling of something that comes from Aristotle. And so the stage embodies what Aristotle put together in his moral thought. When Aristotle is describing how most people think happiness involves or is rooted in sense pleasure, he says this makes them slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts. A life lived solely for sense pleasures makes a person less human. To delight in such things, then, and to love them above all others, he writes, is brutish. So basically, whenever playwrights are making fun of drunkenness, they tend to appeal to this trope of beastliness. Recall the Taming of the Shrew. When the Lord first sees Christopher Sly, he cries out, "O monstrous drunk, how like a swine he lies." For Falstaff, there's a plethora of animalistic associations that are made. For example, he's a bull calf, a bolting hutch of beastliness. A bolting hutch is a trough. So he is the trough that pigs eat out of. It's no surprise that this temperance tract, this early modern party animal tract that I just wrote about or talked about, this is also written by a playwright, and he has a great time, as do others in the period, cataloging like the party animal kingdom. All right, so there's the lion drunk, which breaks glass windows, calls the hostess a whore, strikes, fights, and quarrels with either brother, friend, or father. I'm just gonna lead you through this real quick. There are apparently a lot of viral videos about drunk goats. I don't know, they find piles of apples that have been fermenting or something. Not to be outdone, of course, there's the guzzling goat. Look at him go. And then, I don't know if this is a duck or a vulture or what, but he is a paranoid drunk. Not a happy guy. And then, of course, there's the swine who's pigged out a little bit too much, and he's feeling the effects. All right, that's enough of that. The reactions are telling, okay? There's some of you are repulsed, and some of you are laughing. Some of you are doing both. Here's the thing. As rational animals, we're meant to govern our own actions in a way that lower animals do not. They're ruled by instinct. We were created with a higher capacity. To be drunk is to hand over what makes us unique, namely our rationality. It's a state of being that deprives us of our dignity. And seeing this deprivation in others, it makes us laugh. There's such a thing as, there's a reason why they call it comic deflation. If there's a dignity you should have and it's no longer there, our natural inclination is to laugh, if the context is set in such a way. There are other plays like The Tempest, I know some of you are going to read that soon, where it leads to a different end, and that's kind of predicated on the genre of the play. That's Tempest is a tragedy. No, it's not. Well, for these characters it is, but that plays into it as well. So to be drunk is to hand over what makes us unique, our rationality. For the wives that I've been talking about, the female drinkers, and those female workers in the taverns, going to work, going to have a drink is like going to the zoo. They have to tame these animals, and to do so affords them a social power over these male counterparts who have deprived themselves of their natural dignity. Who's the only fully human person in this image? It's the hostess in the corner serving these beasts. She doesn't overindulge, and therefore she's still fully herself. There's another female figure from antiquity who serves to remind us of this truth, and you see her every time you leave this building and go out the front door. Among the statues of the four cardinal virtues is Lady Temperance. She has a pitcher from which she pours water into a bowl, and in the classical tradition, this is meant to represent the extinguishing of the unruly flames of passion and the diluting of inebriating desire. Her expression is placid, her grip on the vessel is loose and relaxed, just as the virtue she represents is one of ease and responsiveness to the reality of what we take into our hands and then into our mouths. That bowl can only hold so much. Things will get unpleasant if she tries to pour too much. but she is pouring, at least imaginatively. If the thing was just flowing forever, that would mean like temperance is like just drink all you want, it won't ever, but no, that's not how it goes. She is pouring, which is to say temperance is not about total abstinence. It's a virtues pour, a moderate pour. So to conclude, man is a rational animal. Shakespeare and his fellow playwrights appreciate the animality of the rational animal and how it is that what could be considered more animal than rational does find its place within human life and is opened to its own kind of perfection through a participation in intelligence and reason. Temperance is the rational perfection of our appetite for the pleasures of things like food and drink. That appetite can be perfected as long as reason guides the passion, guides the desire, the good natural desire we have for the good stuff around us. So the goal here is not the suppression of all feeling and desire, but the right ordering of it. The temperate person is not the one who simply feels nothing, but rather the one who feels rightly, that is, in accord with the dictates of reason. The temperate person is not the one who possesses no desire for the pleasures of food and drink, but the one who, when experiencing those desires, when they might stir us up in a disordered way, doesn't allow the unruliness of the passions to let him fall away from the path of right action, the kind of action that's going to make him happy. When he does fall away from that path, he becomes less fully human. And he becomes, in that case, a source of comedy for all who can appreciate the joke. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Our tradition at the Humanities Forum is to allow students to ask questions first. Are there any students who would like to ask a question to Brother Jordan based on today's talk or any question whatsoever? Have any volunteers?
They got their extra credit, they're gone.
Stay through the question and answer period to get your full extra credit. That's the key. Anyone? Anybody have the virtue of courage in the audience? Okay, how about any questions? Are there any questions? Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes, sir.
I haven't. I'm visiting. It was the part that really captures like the pressing nature of the question. I was here as a student for 4 years, and I look forward to coming back after I'm ordained a priest. And I'll be here next year, starting in the fall, doing campus ministry. So you get to see me around campus. Don't confuse me with Father Vincent Fair, although everyone does. No, that's the guy who gave the drinking talk. I shouldn't overdrink. And I'll be like, yeah. In the back. Yes.
So I'm wondering. That's okay. I don't. Oh, that's all right. I lectured.
Well, actually,
Oh.
they need it for the.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Do I need to repeat this? Go ahead. Okay. So I get the impression that you're claiming there is an Aristotelian framework to the understanding of virtue in Shakespeare's plays, at least the ones that you were looking at. And I was just wondering, do you know whether he actually read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics? Was that part of his library, for instance? Do we have any type of documentation for this, or is this more something that you see more by implication?
No, that's a great question. He absolutely would have. We don't have any copies of, say, what he would have had in his personal library For a lot of noblemen from this period, we do, and or other Sidney Spencer. But for Shakespeare, we don't have that. We have very little biographical details. But it was common primary school education. As a young man, he would have, if you look at the way that education worked in this period, here's another type that's blown up here, a stereotype. They basically had the equivalent of what you're getting now as like a fifth grader. They had a deep education in the classics, and Plato and Aristotle would have been the cornerstones of that education. So he's absolutely tapping into an Aristotelian framework, and he knows that his audience, by and large, is going to get that. Whether they receive the same education, or even if they were lower commoners who didn't receive that education, it's just in the air. It's part of the milieu, intellectual milieu. Yeah. Yep.
Other than alcoholism, what other literary tactic does Shakespeare, like in any of his plays, does he employ to like promote this idea of temperance?
That's a great question. Yeah, snap that. Temperance involves, this is just one aspect of it, drinking and not over drinking, not under drinking either. There is a good reason. For us, like if it's Easter or Christmas, and the friars get together, it is right and proper to celebrate based on the nature of that, and therefore have a little bit more than you usually would. Not to excess, but it is right and fitting to have that kind of thing. Temperance involves a lot more than just eating and drinking. It also involves chastity, so your relationship to your sexual desires and your ability to control those and order those properly toward their proper end, which is to say, in Shakespeare's period and in the Christian understanding, toward marriage. And so he's got plenty of plays where that's the animating principle or tension around the comic action and sometimes the tragic action. If you want to, Romeo and Juliet is precisely the paradigmatic example of you see something good, Romeo and Juliet see something or someone good, and you find them going through intellectual gymnastics to find a way to get what they want, and they can't be talked to reasonably about it. They go to the Friar Lawrence. He's typically depicted on stage as a Franciscan, thankfully, not a Dominican. I wonder if Friar Lawrence had been a Dominican, I would contend that Romeo and Juliet would have been a comedy, not a tragedy. He would have helped them out. Because he would have talked to them for so long about these theological and philosophical things that they would have just like fallen asleep, and all would have been fine. But that's one. So that's where so chastity is part of it. There's temperance or moderation involved in art, not just our stuff for sense pleasures, but even intellectual pleasures. So like there's an intellectual part of having intellectual virtue is not overindulging, like reading too much. I don't know if that's a temptation for many, and not too little, but finding something proper. And that's, even you can find something like that in The Tempest, Prospero, why he wants to have the knowledge that he has in order to control others in the world around him. So there's a lot of different manifestations of the virtue of temperance and the other virtues.
Enjoyed your talk very much. So I was thinking, you were talking about Christopher Sly. He's drunk. He's humiliated in the play. He's sent home. But I'm wondering if drunkenness is kind of a sustained metaphor in Shakespeare's plays. In Taming of the Shrew, are we meant to see Kate's shrewishness as a kind of drunkenness, out of control? And we just see other plays as sort of guided by this metaphor of drunkenness?
That's a good question. We should talk about that for a lot of years to come, I hope. I didn't bring it up, but so yeah, like Christopher Sly, he's told he's a nobleman, and then they have a play brought out for him to watch, and that becomes the rest of the play. And it's interesting, critics don't know, and then we never see him again. There's nothing clear in the play text what happens to him. Is he watching the whole time? Does he leave at intermission? But you never return to it. Usually you'd have an induction scene like that, a beginning framework, and then you'd find it at the end, like in the Spanish tragedy, other plays in the period. So this is unconventional, and scholars debate why this is the case. Did we just lose the end of the play? But he falls away. He falls into the background, but he sets things up thematically, and then you have this play about a totally unruly young woman who everyone is afraid to marry because she's so overbearing. And then there's a guy who, so she's one excess, she represents one excess, and then there's a really bullheaded guy who does decide, like, no, I'm gonna do this, and and it's very funny. But you've got these two extremes. There's a mean that's established because you have these two extremes coming together. Other plays, I'd have to think about it more. The interesting thing is I haven't read any of these plays in 5 years. I've been reading philosophy and theology and haven't been, I'm studying for the priesthood, and that's why I'm, so this is in my background, but I'd have to think more about a thematic drunkenness that runs like a river through his plays, you know. Yeah, you've been waiting patiently.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay. So thank you, Brother Jordan.
it's also a virtue.
So I'm thinking of, so we have scenes like Christopher Sly, and we have the Sir Toby Belch and Sir Andrew in Twelfth Night, where it's so late that it's early. So you have these scenes where you have drunken characters as sort of a comic foil to show, let's see how unruly these people act when they've had too much to drink. But we also have these scenes like, I'm thinking of the porter in his monologue in the Scottish play, where he's giving some commentary on drinking and the effects of that. Mm-hmm. So is this sort of like another medium of getting the message across? Like, is this sort of an author tract where Shakespeare is speaking primarily through the words of the porter, or is the porter some other comic character that we're supposed to see? Maybe he's half in the bag himself. Is there something? Like, what's the deal with this scene here? Is this a commentary?
You want to know about that scene in particular, the porter scene? That's what you're asking.
Right.
And it reminds me a lot of Hamlet's description of Polonius's court as well, and the debauchery going on there. Critics, I haven't thought about it. Again, I haven't thought about it lately. Critics tend to see it as comic relief. Macbeth is one of those plays where it's so demanding for those main actors. They have so many lines, so much going on, that you basically have this other scene in this tragedy where it's just kind of we don't know if he's half in the bag or what, but this porter coming to the door to answer it, and he's just talking about all these kind of random things, seemingly random things. And I see that as, and often gets cut because people don't know what to make of it. And I have no profound answers myself either. I tend to just read it as when you're up there teaching and you can just tell it's been about 33 minutes and everyone's at that lull, and you need something to just liven them up again. I mean, the tragedy should be carrying people's attention and energy, but if you're somebody like a Christopher Sly who's spent plenty of time next door at the tavern before the play, and you're just not in the mood for this tragedy, you then have something to hang your hat on, at least for a short scene. I guess that's what I would. We'll talk about that more too in years to come, but yes.
I want to continue bombarding you with play-specific questions. You spoke in your talk about how there's a educational or sort of edifying component to the depictions of debauchery and drunkenness, that we learn through negative example more about what it means to be human and control our passions. I'm wondering, in what sense, what is the educational component for Prince Hal as a ruler? Like, why does he spend his formative years with Falstaff and the bawds? Like, is it simply a matter of him gaining insight into the ordering passions as well? Because I'm really curious, like,
Yep.
what is his political education and how is it boosted by running around and mugging people in the night and getting loaded?
No, absolutely. And there's sometimes that's a great question. Sometimes in contemporary versions of the play, he is drinking freely. You look at the play very closely, and I mean, he does say he has a loathing for small beer, which is like commoner's beer. And that's that can also be a metaphor for just, I'm getting sick of this stuff, these antics, and I want to rise to power. Let's go. That's later on. But what he does, power in this period, political power, really, and this is just a kind of universal, especially, it can distance you from reality. When you have power, when people know you're going to be in charge, people treat you differently. And for Hal, with the kind of his political savvy, his intellectual acumen, his ability to read people, he can go somewhere like the Tavern and see people's nepotism, they're sucking up to him for what it is. Like he can see through it. Throughout these plays, characters keep coming up to him and they're like, you know, when you're king, you can do this for me. We can get this done. You know, so they're always appealing to him like that, and so it gives him, I don't know, a habitual disposition to understand that this is what's going to happen when he's in charge. Falstaff is also, I mean, they're the simpletons, and then I mean, Falstaff he's so slippery, he's so good at rhetoric and manipulation, and that's also what a lot of politics is about, unfortunately, that in addition gives Hal an education in precisely the kind of rhetorical savvy that he's going to need when he's king. So Falstaff is, I mean, they have this scene where he gets to play, Falstaff gets to be the king, and he's upbraiding Hal, Prince Henry, as his son. Why are you doing all this stuff? And he's got to give, it's like a mock trial, and then they get to flip places, and so it's all, and this in turn gives those on stage in the tavern and those in the theater who also engage in the tavern life, I would argue, a different perspective on their closeness and their relationship to politics. It was not discussed the way, politics was not lived out the way we do now, where it was like, usually it's equated with the great civilizing effects of tea and coffee. The coffee house culture, where something like the public sphere, what we understand as a public sphere, emerges, scholars say, where people sit down, have a cup, and just talk shop, talk about politics, what's going on and why. But I would say Shakespeare shows like this is possible in the taverns as well. And that's therefore an education for the prince as well as everybody else.
There are many worse sins than drunkenness.
Mm-hmm.
I cannot imagine Iago, I think, is the most evil of Shakespeare's characters, drunk. Well, although Hal isn't quite Iago,
No.
isn't there something manipulative about him? Doesn't he abuse Falstaff's affection for him in ways that at least are edgy,
Yep.
morally?
No. Yeah, where does the jocose lie turn into the that's a great question. That's the way a lot of critics and scholars read Prince Hal as this Machiavellian manipulative competence. Like that's what he's all about. Thinking about the play recently, thinking about it again, and I used to kind of hold that. There are so many scenes where he's telling Falstaff straight up, you got to stop doing this. And it's, he doesn't want Falstaff to fall and perish the way Iago wants Othello and everyone else to. Absolutely not. In fact, in that very last scene where he finally rejects Falstaff, he's made king, he comes out, royal parade, let's party. a little bit, not too much. And Falstaff comes up to him and says, hey, Hal. He calls him Prince Hal, Prince Hal, and which is totally inappropriate. He's now the king. I know thee not, old man, he says. Leave gormandizing, leave your ways. The grave gapes thrice as wide as for anyone else is for you. He makes a fat joke. But he's been telling him throughout these plays, come on, do something. And he's so resolute, he's so habituated to who he wants to be, Falstaff, that it just kind of falls flat.
We have time for one more question, one last question. Anyone? Yes. Great.
I'm very curious about the examples you've used to demonstrate this idea between female and male, their ability to be temperate and to demonstrate that. What are we supposed to make of that today? What kind of commentary is Shakespeare trying to make? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Do you want applications for like today, or do you think just for his time? Let's see, I would say they both in the Renaissance period, both men and women were. It was dangerous for them. It was a threat. Intemperance is a perpetual threat, but it manifests itself in different ways just because of the differences between them, the natural differences. I mean, there's. I don't want to read. I want to read it through the anxieties, I guess, in the period, and the complementarity between them. But what I find most interesting about it is actually how, despite the physiological differences between, guys can just generally drink more than women. But there's, for both of them, for male or female characters, and of course in this period there's a strict hierarchy, wives be subordinate to your husbands kind of thing. It's a patriarchy, that's what I'm trying to say. To each and all is extended this potential for and the desirability of self-mastery, self-rule. So no matter what, so typically in the period women were considered the weaker sex. Despite perceived natural strengths or weaknesses, for Shakespeare and for these other playwrights, temperance and virtue more generally is something for everybody. Because of that common humanality that we have, everyone has rational capacity. Everyone can develop their reason such that it guides their passions and it makes them more human. So that's something that fascinates me in getting the chance to think about this more for this talk. So, good question.
I just want to thank Brother Jordan again, and I want to just remind everyone that we have some appetizers and refreshments in the great room. So please join us there for more conversation and more fellowship. And let's give Brother Jordan a round of applause.